Was Vichy active or passive?
French classicism is something that the Germans spent their lives trying to fight against. Interestingly, going back to another period,
but if you look at the German archives, it turns out that there's a great difference over time.
Shakespeare was anti-French classicism.
Hitler mainly wanted to concentrate on the invasion of England. Was Vichy active or passive?
French classicism is something that the Germans spent their lives trying to fight against. Interestingly, going back to another period,
but if you look at the German archives, it turns out that there's a great difference over time.
Shakespeare was anti-French classicism.
Hitler mainly wanted to concentrate on the invasion of England.
In preparing for tonight's event, it's 67 years basically since the occupation ended, and yet in France the residue of that experience continues to this day. So very graciously, Stefan was happy to post the flyer in the hotel, but you'll notice that the Pétain flag and the Hakenkreuz have been buffed out. God forbid somebody who spoke French would see this and not get a sense of what it's all about. So that sensibility remains. 67 years after the fact, and it still persists in the ways I think, to some degree, I think the Germans have confronted it. They may never get over it. They're probably tired of being blamed for everything forever. Robert Paxton's epic work will be available for sale, as will Alan Riding's work. No discussion of the occupation in France can begin without Robert Paxton. The discussion, the debate exists in what we know as Bépée and Appé, which is before Paxton and after Paxton. And this work completely changed the way in which this discussion took place. Simultaneous, or almost simultaneous, with the publication of this book was largely through the efforts of François Truffaut. La Chagrin et la Pitié, The Sorrow and the Pity, found its way to French television and then eventually internationally. I was just remarking that on Sunday in preparation, I rewatched La Combe Lucien, Louis Malle's film from 1974. Michel Drac had a film called Le Violin du Bal. And Lozi did a phenomenal film, largely funded by Alain Delon, called Monsieur Klein. And all these began to really dig very, very deep. And they're not melodramatic, they're highly nuanced, and very much a part of what I would call the canon. But it begins and ends with Paxton's book. I was interviewing Jean-Paul Rapneau, the film director, in relation to a film called Bon Voyage, which was the final days at the Hotel Splendide in Bordeaux, where the government had begun to move. And in this gigantic dining room, on one side of the room you had Maréchal Pétain and Charles de Gaulle, who the following day would leave for England. There's a little bit of like a Feydeau farce in which he described it as being that. But I had mentioned Ophel's work, and he said, but the greatest authority is Robert Paxton. Robert Paxton, will you join us, please? Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
That the role of the public intellectual was once again identified with the Paris left bank. Ça suffit.
The huge difference is between the occupied zone and the unoccupied zone. In the occupied zone, the Germans are present. After November 1942, they're present everywhere, and the differences really fall away. In the unoccupied zone, you had the impression that you were in France, and you had a French head of state and a French government, though increasingly they were not able to do what they wanted. Now, as far as getting enough to eat is concerned, I don't think there's very much difference between the occupied and the unoccupied zone. There's a tremendous difference between living in the city and living in the country. If you were lucky and lived in the country, you probably had more than you could possibly eat, and you ate more than ever because you weren't sure about tomorrow. And you've sold the rest on the black market for incredible amounts of money. In the city, you might be able to keep rabbits in your apartment, but basically you couldn't do much to produce bread. And so a lot of French people in the cities got by on 1,000 calories a day toward the end of the occupation, which is not the subsistence level. So the occupation did divide French people up. Some people did better than others, and it was a profoundly divisive experience for the French people.
The very first statute on Jews in October 1940 already eliminated Jews from the entire movie industry, because that had been an obsession of a lot of the right wing in the 30s, that the Jews were running the movie. So they were, and then in subsequent measures taken by Vichy, they basically removed actors and performers and everybody else, and writers. Well, that writers was with the agreement of the publishers. So there were, now when there were lots and lots of Jews hiding in the south of France, or living at first, shall we say. I wouldn't say hiding necessarily, living, and some of them, but some of them changed their names, and some of them went more into obscure little villages where the Germans never even showed up. So, but the fear factor did definitely increase. I mean, even we didn't talk about Maurice Chevalier, but Maurice Chevalier, his girlfriend was a Romanian Jewish actress. And he had a big pad in the south of France, quite near Opio, swimming pool, and early on you'll see, during the occupation of the northern France, you'll see pictures, and like you would today, of some sort of nice scene in the Côte d'Azur of wealthy people hanging out. But by 43, his girlfriend's parents were Romanian Jews also, had been in Nice, and they came and joined and sort of took refuge under his wing. And by 44, he also, because he'd been attacked like mad by the resistance for having sung in Germany and a bunch of other things, he found himself, on the one hand, fearing being caught by the Gestapo because of the Jews he was with, and the other side being shot by the resistance. So, yes, the fear definitely increased enormously that period. An extraordinary number of people would go to the theatre and go to the movies and attend whatever events that were available. Now, in some cases they're doing because that's, it's a way of breathing for them in a new way. In many people, old people would say, oh, we went to keep warm in the cinemas in the winter. But then you have the people at the top who, in some ways, I was talking about a great deal. And many of these people had access, they had money, or they had quite good jobs, and they had access to the black market. I mean, at the end, around the time of D-Day, you had the groups of heroic resistance, shall we say, or semi-resistance, having what they called fiestas. I mean, they used the Spanish word, fiestas. And this was Sartre and Camus, and Picasso would go to some of them. And Simone de Beauvoir, in her memoirs, talked about how the principal thing that she said there was very little sex because we were all too drunk.
I want to thank you all for coming. It's been a particularly interesting evening and a pleasure for me to have both of these gentlemen here to educate us on this subject. Maybe the next time they'll come back, we'll talk about De Gaulle. Good guy, bad guy. That might be a subject for discussion.